Behind the veils of official history, among lost manuscripts and echoes of ancestral wisdom, rests the name of a forgotten brotherhood, the Order of the Illuminated of Judea. A name that is rarely heard, but like a gentle breeze, it quietly blew over the most sensitive souls, guiding them to a kingdom that is not seen with the eyes, but pulses within every awakened being. Unlike other secret societies that sought worldly power, this order dedicated itself to the awakening of consciousness and spiritual elevation, operating in the shadows of a turbulent time where the empire crushed bodies but could not extinguish the light of an ignited soul. The mystery that surrounds it is not a mere riddle to be solved. It is a call to return, a reminder of who we were before the fall into the illusion of matter. In the 1st century of our era, Judea was abuzz with tensions. Under Roman rule, with Pharisees and Sadducees vying for space and influence, the people were torn between the hope of a liberating Messiah and the constant fear of repression. However, far from the visible disputes, a small group gathered discreetly in the hills, in the desert caves, and in the refuges of the soul. They were seekers of truth, initiated into a knowledge prior to the temples and beyond the letters. Many of them were born within the Jewish religion itself, but they surpassed its formal boundaries, seeking a light that would lead them not only to a promised salvation, but to a real present transformation here and now. The order did not emerge from a dramatic event, nor was it founded in a public square. It formed as a secret stream of consciousness, transmitted from master to disciple, from gaze to gaze. Its records were not on papyrus, but in silent gestures, symbols carved into stones, and metaphors etched into the soul. Those who participated in it did not carry pompous titles, but subtle signs that only an initiate could recognize. The outside world saw them as wanderers, hermits, or even heretics, but among them they knew they were part of something greater, a stream of living wisdom that came from above, flowed through the earth, and prepared souls for the invisible kingdom. This kingdom was the core of their teachings, not a geographical place, nor a post-death promise, but a state of being, a dimension of consciousness accessible only to the pure of heart and awakened mind. The enlightened taught that the kingdom is here, not among buildings and armies, but at the center of one's being. Entering this kingdom required more than faith. It demanded surrender, renunciation of the ego, and a deep dive into inner silence. Therefore, the order did not proselytize or clamor for crowds. Only the ready were called, and even those called had to go through long internal journeys to perhaps glimpse the hidden light behind the veil. What separated the order from ordinary religious people was the conviction that truth cannot be taught, but only remembered. Thus, their rituals were not external worship, but instruments of inner remembrance. Their chants were not seeking to please gods, but to tune the soul to the frequency of the divine. Everything they did, from fasting to contemplation, was a preparation for the return to what we have always been, before the illusion of separation. And for this, silence was their greatest ally. A silence that spoke more than 1,000 sermons, revealing the invisible to those who dared to listen with their heart. In the ruins of Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, some scholars claim to have found echoes of this order. Ciphered phrases, descriptions of rituals, concepts that transcend orthodoxy and indicate a deep, inner, and revolutionary spirituality. It is no coincidence that these manuscripts have remained hidden for centuries, as if time had kept them for a time when the world was once again thirsty for authenticity and meaning. The enlightened did not disappear, they fell silent. And this silence, more than absence, was a form of preservation, for they knew that time would reveal only to those with ears to hear. The relationship of the order with Jewish spirituality was delicate. Although deeply respectful of the Torah and traditions, they saw in the sacred texts not literal commands, but symbolic maps of the soul's journey. For them, Abraham represented the faith that dares to step out of the known. Moses symbolized the mind that leads the soul out of inner slavery, and the desert was more than a landscape. It was a metaphor for the fertile void where God reveals himself. They interpreted the stories not as historical facts, but as encoded teachings about spiritual awakening, and for this reason, they greatly disturbed the guardians of the letter. The preparation of the members was rigorous. Before they were considered ready for any revelation, they had to undergo silent trials, which tested their commitment, patience, and humility. One of the biggest mistakes made by those seeking the order was desiring spiritual power. For the illuminated, the true power lay in completely emptying oneself until becoming a vessel where the divine light could dwell without distortion. The initiation began in the outer world, but ended in the heart of the initiate. And not everyone made it there. Many gave up, others went mad when confronting their shadows. Only the persevering crossed the threshold of the kingdom. The need to keep secrets was vital, not only to escape Roman persecution or accusations from the Pharisees, but because they understood that mysteries cannot be trivialized. The truth revealed to an unprepared soul becomes poison. Therefore, they protected the teachings as if they were sacred fire, useful to the world, but destructive if handled without respect. Their language was veiled, their presence discreet, and their meetings were shrouded in symbolism that confused the uninitiated. Nothing was as it seemed. Everything was an initiation, even the silence. Quotes from ancient thinkers mention enigmatic figures who roamed Judea preaching the inner kingdom, performing healings, and awakening consciousness. Some historians believe that these accounts refer not only to Jesus or John the Baptist, but to other masters of the same silent lineage. A lineage that never sought fame or followers, but profoundly influenced those who were ready to see beyond the visible world. And perhaps, in the deserts of the human soul, these masters still walk, invisible to common eyes, but tangible to the awakened spirit. What remains of the order in today's world? Not official documents, nor visible hierarchies. What remains is a whisper in the heart of those who seek more than answers. They seek meaning. It's the sparkle in the eyes of those who awaken from a long inner slumber. It's the compassionate gesture made in silence, the forgiveness offered without fanfare, the choice of goodness even without applause. The order was never an institution. It was, and still is, a state of consciousness. And those who resonate with its vibration become part of it, even without knowing its name. For the kingdom is not of words, it is of presence. The order of the illuminated from Judea does not need to be discovered to fulfill its mission. It already does so, invisibly, guiding those who silently feel that there is something beyond the surface of life. Those who hear the call, those who traverse the dark night of the soul in search of light, those who silence the ego to listen to the soul, these are the ones who enter the kingdom. And in doing so, they become, quietly, part of the same order, not through external affiliation, but through internal transformation. For what the ancients knew, and the wise still remember, is that the kingdom is within you. The origin of the Order of the Illuminated of Judea is shrouded in a sacred mist that eludes the linearity of traditional records. There is no official date, nor a document that proclaims its foundation. It was born in the silence of the deserts, in the heart of seekers who refused the rigidity of external practices and yearned for a living truth. Its seed germinated among the Essenes and other mystical groups of the time, but it transcended the boundaries of these traditions. The order was not built on stone, but on awakened consciousness. It emerged as a natural response to the spiritual collapse of a time dominated by dogmas and political conveniences disguised as faith. It was necessary to recover the divine spark in man, to rekindle the golden thread that links the human to the eternal. And so, discreetly, it was forming, not as an institution, but as a living current flowing among the souls thirsty for light. The founding master is a figure both concrete and archetypal. Some manuscripts suggest that he lived in the 1st century before the Common Era, a man of profound wisdom, educated in the mysteries of Egypt and initiated into the Hebrew traditions, who returned to Judea with the purpose of planting a seed of spiritual liberation. Other scholars see him as a symbol, a collective representation of the early initiates who felt the call. His true name remains hidden, known only by his closest successors. He was referred to as the mirror of the kingdom, for he reflected without distortion the divine presence. He did not seek followers nor fame. His work was to prepare others to see the kingdom with the eyes of the soul, and his mission did not end with his physical death. for the true initiation continues on invisible levels. The first teachings were transmitted orally, carefully preserved through mnemonic formulas, secret chants, and symbolic stories. This orality was not casual. It was believed that the living word, spoken in the silence of the heart, carried a vibration that activated centers of spiritual perception. Each sentence was more than a teaching. It was a trigger for awakening. Eventually, some of these knowledges were recorded in hidden papyri, protected by layers of symbolism and encryption that only the initiated could decipher. These texts never circulated freely. They were entrusted to specific guardians, who hid them in rocks, in hidden libraries, or in the recesses of their own souls, like someone sheltering a flame in the midst of a hurricane. Initiation into the order was a lengthy, demanding, and deeply transformative process. It was not a single ceremony, but a series of progressive experiences that challenged the mind, purified the emotions, and freed the spirit. The aspirant underwent internal trials, fasting, long periods of silence, and intense meditative practices. At each stage, a veil was lifted. Gradually, the common senses gave way to spiritual perception. Everyday reality dissolved, and a new world was revealed, not outside, but within. The initiate began to realize that everything he had been taught about God, time, soul, and salvation needed to be transcended. It was the beginning of a new existence. The order had a subtle internal structure, a hierarchy not based on power, but on levels of consciousness. There were concentric circles, each containing deeper teachings, accessible only to those who demonstrated not just knowledge, but purity and service. The most advanced masters did not identify themselves as leaders, but as mirrors. Their role was to help the disciples recognize the light that already resided in them. There was no competition, no dispute. Spiritual ascension was recognized by the light that naturally emanated from one's presence, by the silent compassion, by the wisdom that flowed effortlessly. The higher one ascended, the more invisible the initiate became to the world. Symbolism was a central element in the transmission of knowledge. The order developed an extensive set of symbols, diagrams, and gestures that encoded complex ideas into simple forms. Among them were the inverted triangle, representing the descent of the spirit into matter, the triple flame, a sign of the union between body, soul, and spirit, and the incomplete circle, indicating the unfinished journey of the human being towards wholeness. Each symbol was like a gateway. Meditating on it was to open a hidden dimension of reality. These signs appeared on clothing, ritual objects, and even in the ways of walking and breathing. They were a silent language that allowed members to recognize each other even among hostile crowds. There were also secret identification codes, specific greetings, voice intonations, subtle hand movements. Nothing was random. Each gesture, each silence was imbued with intention. Thus, even when persecuted, the enlightened could meet, exchange teachings, and continue transmitting their legacy without being noticed. This ability to remain invisible while operating was one of the reasons for their longevity. The order adapted to the time, the place, the threats, without ever betraying its essence. They changed names, disguised themselves under other traditions, but they never ceased to be who they were, instruments of the silent light. Connections with other mystery schools were inevitable. Some members had studied in Egyptian temples, others had contact with Persian and even Buddhist masters. The order did not see itself as the sole holder of truth, but as the guardian of a specific strand of universal knowledge. Knowledge was a bridge, not a prison. They respected other traditions, silently dialogued with them, and absorbed what resonated in harmony. But they never blended to the point of losing their identity. Their essence was radical inwardness, the purity of direct contact with the divine, without intermediaries, without dogmas. The material world was seen as a temporary illusion. This did not mean contempt for life, but a deep understanding that everything that is born dies, and everything that changes is not essential. Thus, the enlightened rejected accumulation, ostentation, attachment. They lived simply, some as craftsmen, healers, writing masters. They used everyday life as a practice field. Every act was an opportunity to awaken. eating, walking, talking. Everything could be a prayer if done with presence. True abundance, they said, was inner freedom. To be free from the desire for control, free from fear, free from the ego. The ultimate goal was truth, not a theoretical truth nor a dogma to be followed, but the direct experience of reality. This truth could not be taught, only evoked. When a disciple asked what was the truth, the master responded with silence, or with a look, or with a question that disarmed the mind. The path was not linear. Each one was guided according to their degree of readiness, but all followed the same call, to transcend illusion and return to the center. The kingdom was not distant, it was just veiled. The function of the order was to remove this veil. The preservation of secrets was an art in itself. They knew that the ego loved to appropriate the sacred to exalt itself. Therefore, they protected the teachings with extreme wisdom. A revealing text could be camouflaged in a children's story, a sacred symbol disguised in a common tapestry. Many of the texts we now consider heretical hide, in their symbolic structure, fragments of this wisdom. The physical destruction of scrolls did not destroy the order, for its real library was internal. Each initiate became a living book, each generation renewed the sacred memory. The tradition was alive, organic, silent. And so, with light steps and burning hearts, the first enlightened ones of Judea laid the foundations of an order that would span centuries without ever establishing itself as a power. Its foundation was not an event, it was a vibration, a frequency that still echoes in restless souls, in truth seekers, in those who refuse to accept superficiality as the ultimate reality. The order was born to guide souls, not to convert bodies. Its temple is the purified heart, its altar, attentive silence, and its foundation continues whenever someone awakens to what has always been. The Order of the Illuminated of Judea was not conceived as a mystical refuge for sensitive souls, nor as a secret rebellion against established religious power. Its mission was infinitely more subtle and powerful. It was born with the deep purpose of guiding souls to the kingdom, not as a philosophical concept or heavenly doctrine, but as an internal, living, and vibrant reality which manifested as the ego dissolved and the essence of being emerged. This mission was non-negotiable, unrenounceable, unmistakable. The initiates understood that the kingdom was not a place, but a state of purity, of unity, of spiritual lucidity that could and should and be accessed even in this life. The order did not expect its members to be saved after death. It trained them to resurrect in life, to inhabit the eternal in the now, and thus become a beacon for those who still walked in the shadow of ignorance. Guiding a soul was more than directing with words. It was leading it through its own inner darkness, confronting resistances, fears, and memories that held it captive. It was an act of profound love and immense responsibility. To this end, the more experienced members of the order developed specific practices of sacred listening, active silence, and vibrational perception. They sat with the initiates in silent meditations where no words were spoken, but where the deepest truths revealed themselves in the shared energetic field. It was a kind of direct spiritual transmission, as if one soul awakened another through resonance. The sacred mission required complete detachment from external recognition, for the true work was invisible to the world's eyes. The enlightened became living bridges between heaven and earth. The concept of enlightenment, as practiced by the order, was not an extraordinary experience that elevated the individual above others. On the contrary, it was the humble return to the original essence. To be enlightened meant to be awake to the truth, not as belief, but as direct experience, and to live from that state with simplicity and compassion. The order taught that true enlightenment happened in everyday life, forgiving an enemy, embracing the pain of another being, choosing silence over vanity, serving without expecting return. Guiding souls was, therefore, a continuous gesture of presence and surrender. The initiate was not a leader, but a lit candle, and their light, when touching another soul, initiated the process of silent ascension towards the kingdom. The selection of disciples was carried out with almost mystical precision. It wasn't enough to show interest or knowledge. The true aspirants were recognized by their vibration, by the existential unrest that could no longer be contained, by the silent tears shed upon hearing a forgotten truth. The masters of the order closely observed the internal signs, not the external speeches. Sometimes, a single glance was enough to recognize a legitimate calling. On other occasions, it was necessary to test the seeker with disconcerting questions, long waiting periods, or humble tasks. Those driven by spiritual vanity or the pursuit of hidden powers were gently turned away. Only those who remained, even without promises, even without immediate answers, were led forward. For guiding a soul required total trust from the initiate and the master. The difference between faith and inner knowledge was constantly emphasized by the enlightened. While faith could be sustained by doctrines or emotions, inner knowledge emerged from direct contact with the divine within oneself. It was non-transferable, irreversible, unbreakable, and this knowledge was not the result of logical reasoning, but of silent revelation. The members of the order stated that truth is not learned, it is remembered, and this recollection occurred when the soul, purified of its impurities, became a clear mirror of the eternal. The kingdom was not a dogma to be defended, but a presence to be recognized, and this recognition was the greatest liberation a human being could experience. The virtues cultivated within the order were silent and revolutionary. Silence, because from it sprang true listening. Purity, not as moral rigidity, but as clarity of intention. Truth, not as arrogant assertion, but as inner transparency. The members did not strive to be virtuous. They naturally became so as the veils of illusion fell. The order taught that true virtues could not be feigned, for they were fruits of the transformation of the being, not the effort of the persona. Thus, each initiate was called to a rigorous internal process, where the masks fell and only the essence remained. It was this essence that guided other souls, not the speeches or appearances. The initiatory trail consisted of various levels of awakening, each one deeper than the previous. In the beginning, the disciple learned to observe their thoughts and emotions without identifying with them. Then, they were led to practices of prolonged silence, fasting, active prayer, and vibrational meditations. Next, they faced their own ancestral fears, their guilt, their childhood wounds, and their spiritual illusions. It was a process of painful polishing, but liberating. Each phase was accompanied by a mentor who, without interfering, maintained their presence like an invisible guardian of the journey. In the end, the initiate awoke to a consciousness that did not depend on belief but on direct experience. They became one with the order, not by title, but by resonance. Among the symbolic instruments used in the rituals were darkened mirrors, which represented the ego-distorting light, empty bowls symbolizing total surrender, braided ropes reminding of the interconnectedness of all souls, and white stones given only to those who had crossed the final veil. These objects had no power in themselves, but served as anchors for inner experiences. Each symbol was an invitation to introspection. There was no worship, only contemplation. The order believed that contact with the sacred was only possible when the heart was present. And so, every gesture, every object, every silence became sacred. Near-death experiences were also part of the tradition, not in a literal sense, but symbolic. The disciple was led to experiences where they confronted the idea of the death of the ego, of time, and of identity. In special rituals, they would spend hours in absolute darkness, in total isolation, where only the sound of their own breath echoed. Many reported visions, encounters with invisible masters, sensations of body dissolution. These experiences were not induced by external substances, but by age-old methods of breathing, concentration, and surrender. Upon returning, the disciple was no longer the same. Something died, something was born, and this rebirth was the real beginning of the journey. The reading of the Torah was performed in a deeply symbolic manner. The enlightened saw in each story an initiatory metaphor. The Exodus, for example, was not just the departure from physical Egypt, but the liberation of the soul from conditionings. Solomon's temple represented the human body as the dwelling place of the spirit. The Ark of the Covenant was a symbol of the divine spark that inhabits each being, and the prophets were understood as archetypes of the inner voice that cries out in the wilderness of consciousness. This expanded reading allowed the initiate to reconnect with the spiritual roots of their tradition without falling into literalness. The order did not reject religion, it transcended it. At the heart of all these teachings was the certainty that the human soul is, in its origin, divine. But this divinity needs to be rediscovered, redeemed, and reincarnated in daily life. The mission of the order was to rekindle this memory, to create spaces where the forgotten light could shine again. There was no promise of heaven, nor threat of hell. There was only the invitation to awaken, and upon awakening, to become a guide, a candle, a channel. The mission was a spiral. Those who were guided became guides. And so, in silence, the order fulfilled its reason for existing, generation after generation, life after life, soul after soul. The Order of the Illuminated of Judea understood that common language, made of sounds and recognizable symbols, was too limited to contain and convey eternal truths. Words could be distorted, manipulated, lost over time. Therefore, they developed a form of communication that transcended literalness and was based on the invisible, a symbolic, vibrational, intuitive language that operated not only through the mind, but through the spirit. It was the language of awakened souls, recognizable only by those who had already crossed the veils of rational interpretation. This hidden language was not limited to letters or sounds. It involved gestures, pauses, symbols, silences, geometries, and even glances. Through this language, they transmitted not only knowledge, but consciousness, making each word a key, each gesture a door to the kingdom. Metaphors, parables, and riddles were the main tools of this spiritual language. The order understood that what is said directly loses its potency in the face of a conditioned mind. Therefore, they preferred symbolic tales, poetic images, layered narratives. A single teaching could contain dozens of levels of reading, depending on the listener's degree of consciousness. When a disciple heard a parable for the first time, they understood a moral or ethical aspect. Upon deeper meditation, they discovered psychological, alchemical, mystical teachings. The truth was always hidden behind the veil of the symbol. Only those with a pure heart and an open mind could break through the layers and access the hidden essence in each word. The sacred language used in the rituals was not made of common words. The chants were composed of sounds that activated altered states of consciousness, vibrating in harmony with subtle centers of the body and soul. Many of these sounds had no literal meaning, but functioned as sonic keys. They were archaic syllables, many of which came from ancient Semitic and pre-Hebraic traditions, combined in a way that resonated within the initiate, provoking alignment, purification, expansion. During the deepest rituals, the silence between the sounds was as important as the sounds themselves. It was in this space between the vibrations that the divine presence manifested, not as form, but as subtle perception. The sacred language was not only heard with the ears, it was felt with the entire being. The Hebrew alphabet, with its 22 letters, was considered one of the most powerful spiritual tools of the order, not as a mere phonetic set, but as a symbolic and energetic system. Each letter was seen as an expression of creation, containing specific forces, archetypes, and spiritual gateways. The letters were not only studied for reading or writing, but for meditation. The practice of visualizing a letter, breathing with it, chanting it in a certain tone was a way to activate specific aspects of the soul. For example, the letter Aleph represented the primordial unity, the divine breath before duality. The Shin, symbol of spiritual fire, was used in rituals of inner transmutation. The initiate learned to use the letters as tools for journeying within themselves, accessing ancestral memories, latent gifts, deep understandings of the cosmos. The Kabbalah, or the Hebrew mystical tradition, was one of the pillars of linguistic knowledge of the order. However, its interpretation was very different from later and more academic approaches. For the enlightened, the tree of life was not just a metaphysical diagram, but a practical map of the soul. Each sephira represented an internal aspect that needed to be recognized, balanced, and enlightened. The ascent up the tree was not theoretical, but experiential. The initiate learned to meditate on the paths, to visualize the connections, to feel the energy flows between the spheres. This practice was always accompanied by silence and deep contemplation, as it was not a mental exercise but a spiritual plunge. And in this plunge, language became pure vibration, where the secret name of God was not pronounced but lived. Sacred numerology was also essential. Each number was seen as a frequency, a pure form. The number 1 symbolized the origin, the divine uniqueness. The 2, the necessary duality for creation. The 3, the reconciliation of opposites. The 7 was the number of spiritual achievement in matter. The enlightened used numbers to encode teachings, conceal secrets, and organize their practices. A number inscribed on a stone could contain an entire ritual instruction. The combination of letters and numbers, especially with the use of gematria, revealed hidden relationships between seemingly distant words, creating a network of interconnected meanings. Reality was perceived as a large encoded text, where everything had purpose and message. To know how to read this text was to become initiated. The meditation practices of the order were built upon this invisible language. The initiate was instructed to contemplate certain symbols while breathing rhythmically, uttering sacred syllables, and maintaining the mind in a state of silent attentiveness. Sometimes, a sequence of flaming letters was visualized, other times a path unfolding in the darkness, guided by an inner star. These visualizations were not inventions of the mind, but activations of archetypal memories. The deeper the disciple delved into this symbolic universe, the more they recognized that the language of the soul was universal. Even without ever having met, different initiates reported similar experiences, the same symbols, the same sounds, the same visions. It was confirmation that what they accessed was not imagination, but shared spiritual reality. The sacred chants, known as shirim, were moments of pure elevation. Sung in unison or individually, with gentle rhythms and subtle variations in intonation, these chants created a vibrational field that transformed the environment and elevated the frequency of the participants. Each note was chosen carefully, as they knew that sound vibration shaped matter and influenced the spiritual field. In many rituals, the enlightened ones did not sing with words, but with pure sounds, almost like pre-verbal mantras. Music became a vehicle for ascension, an invisible ladder towards the kingdom. The whole body vibrated, the mind quieted, and the soul became receptive to the divine presence. The power of silence was absolute. More than any word, the profound silence was the purest channel of communication between awakened souls. In many practices, initiates would spend days in complete seclusion, listening only to themselves and the subtle murmur of the spirit. In this state, answers would emerge without being formulated. Teachings would reveal themselves without being spoken. Silence was respected as a living entity, an invisible temple where God spoke directly. It was in this sonic void that the order transmitted its highest teachings. Those who learned to listen to silence no longer needed external masters. The true master, they said, resides in the center of silence. The oral transmission was conducted with immense reverence. When a teaching was passed from master to disciple, a silent ritual preceded the act. Eyes met, bodies remained still, and only when both were tuned into the same vibration were the words spoken. And these words were not ordinary. They were imbued with energy, intention, power. The disciple felt the teaching in their body, as if it had been inscribed in their soul. In some cases, the words were not even intellectually understood, but they produced immediate transformative effects. This form of teaching required purity, silence, and absolute trust. It was a sacred pact. Among the members of the order, there were secret signs that allowed mutual recognition. A light touch on the shoulder, a hand gesture, a specific intonation when pronouncing a name. These codes were simple but carried immense meaning. Amid crowds, they allowed two initiates to identify each other without attracting attention. In times of persecution, they saved lives. In times of peace, they ensured the continuity of the spiritual lineage. The hidden language was not only used for protection, it was used for preservation. It was the invisible web that connected awakened hearts through time and space. The language of the Order of the Illuminati of Judea was not a communication tool. It was a vehicle of transformation. By penetrating the symbols, the sounds, the silences, The disciple was gradually unbound from their mental ties and led to the kingdom. It was the language of the Spirit, the grammar of eternity, the alphabet of light, and whoever learned to speak this language never again got confused with the voices of the world, for they recognized in every heartbeat, in every conscious breath, the eternal whisper of the divine calling to awaken. The depth of the teachings of the Order of the Illuminated from Judea would inevitably put it on a collision course with the dominant structures of its time. Living in a territory dominated by the Roman Empire and under the strong influence of Orthodox Jewish religious groups, the Illuminated represented a silent and powerful threat, not through weapons or revolts, but through their ability to free consciousness from mental and institutional control. They did not encourage political rebellion, but the subversion of illusion, which to the power holders was even more dangerous. An awakened soul could not be manipulated, corrupted, nor dominated by fear or promise. This made the Order an inevitable target of persecutions, accusations, and attempts at destruction, even though almost no one knew clearly who they were or where they were located. The religious authorities viewed the Illuminated with deep suspicion. Their teachings transcended the dogmas of the Torah, interpreted literally, and exposed the emptiness of external practices when devoid of internal presence. For the Pharisees and Sadducees, who upheld their prestige on the strict interpretation of the Scriptures, the Order was a scandal. The mere suggestion that the kingdom of God was already accessible, here and now, without intermediaries, was a direct affront to the religious monopoly. This veiled accusation of heresy put them in the same condition as other mystical groups, such as the Essenes and certain Gnostics, who were also marginalized. But unlike these, the Order remained even more discreet, almost ethereal, making it difficult to identify, and for this very reason, even more feared. The Roman Empire, pragmatic and relentless, was not interested in spiritual subtleties, but any movement that could foster ideas of inner freedom was seen as potentially subversive. The Order did not preach revolt, but taught that no external authority had the power to define the ultimate truth. This was enough for its members to be labeled as dissidents. Rumors spread that they practiced witchcraft, that they hid cursed scrolls, that they openly defied traditions. The truth was much more subtle. They simply chose an inner path. But in a world where everything is controlled by appearance and fear, the invisible scares. Silence is unsettling. Inner freedom is seen as a threat. To escape destruction, the Order developed a strategy of intentional invisibility. They sought refuge in the desert regions of Judea, in the mountains of Galilee, in hidden caves near the Dead Sea, and among spiritual communities that provided them shelter. There, far from prying eyes, they could continue their practices, form new disciples, and preserve the most sacred teachings. But it wasn't always enough to hide physically. It was also necessary to erase traces, erase names, transfigure identities. The Order then fragmented and spread, like a seed carried by the wind. Each group retained part of the wisdom, each master preserved fragments of the tradition. Thus, even if one core was destroyed, the essence remained alive in another corner. One of the most ingenious strategies adopted by the enlightened was that of symbolic disappearance. In certain moments of high political or religious tension, they chose to temporarily dissolve their meetings, completely silence any external ritual practice, and assume ordinary roles within society. They became scribes, sheepherders, weavers, travelers. They blended in with the common people, leaving no signs of their true affiliation. Only the most trained knew how to recognize them. And even then, meetings were avoided until the time was safe again. It was not a matter of cowardice, but of profound wisdom. The truth does not need to impose itself. It needs to survive. Many of the Order's records were deliberately destroyed by the members themselves. Sacred manuscripts, detailed rituals, symbolic maps, all of this was burned, undone, or hidden in places so remote that no one would ever find them. This destruction was not loss, but sacrifice. They knew that true knowledge was inscribed in the hearts of the initiates. The texts were merely temporary portals. When there was a risk of them falling into the wrong hands, they would respectfully dispose of them, as if returning to the ether what could not be profaned. This practice ensured that many of the Order's mysteries would never be corrupted or used for selfish purposes. Even under persecution, the Order found ways to continue its lineage. Masters took refuge in other mystical traditions, adopted new names, and founded small schools of wisdom disguised as ethical or philosophical movements. Some approached the Essenes and taught there in a coded manner. Others infiltrated commercial caravans, carrying the teachings in the form of stories, poems, and songs. The lineage did not depend on a name or a specific location. It survived wherever a soul was touched by its vibration. Thus, in an almost miraculous way, the order traversed the centuries like a subterranean river that, from time to time, resurfaced. At certain moments, they deliberately created false texts with superficial, mystical language to mislead their pursuers. These texts were purposely left in places where they would be found by religious authorities or Roman soldiers. Upon analyzing these writings, they thought they had captured the secrets of the order, when in fact they were merely dealing with empty shells, created with the intention of protecting the true core. This technique of spiritual disinformation was an extreme but necessary resource, for they knew that in the wrong hands, a sacred teaching could become an instrument of manipulation and destruction. Better to confuse than to corrupt. The resistance of the order was carried out through silence, a conscious, active silence laden with meaning. It was not the absence of sound, but a profound presence. While temples fell, empires crumbled, and doctrines became corrupted, the order remained firm at the center of being. Its members knew that truth could not be wounded by swords or erased by decrees. It continued to live wherever there was a sincere heart, an attentive gaze, a thirsty soul. The order was, in essence, indestructible, because it was not fixed in external structures. It was like the wind, invisible, but real. And wherever it blew, it renewed the spiritual life of humanity. The enlightened did not hate their persecutors. On the contrary, they prayed for them in silence, understanding that they acted out of ignorance and fear. They knew that deep down, every human being seeks the same things: peace, meaning, connection. But while the ego reigns, these pursuits transform into control, violence, and pride. The order's mission was not to defeat their enemies, but to illuminate the world's darkness with their very presence. And this was only possible by remaining faithful to their inner truth, even under threat, even under torture, even in the face of death. Many died in silence, with their eyes closed in peace, knowing that the kingdom already dwelled within them, and this silent death was, to them, a victory. Over time, the echoes of the order have faded into history, confused with other mystical movements, attributed to legendary characters, or considered myths. But those who have eyes to see, ears to hear, recognize its silent signature in many traditions. Its symbols appear in medieval manuscripts. Its ideas echo in the texts of the Gnostics, the Kabbalists, the Christian mystics, the Sufis. Its legacy is invisible, but present, a line of light cutting through the darkness of ignorance, guiding souls with gentleness, courage, and compassion. Even in silence, the order spoke, and its voice continues to echo wherever there is a spirit willing to listen. The Order of the Illuminated of Judea did not survive despite the silence. It survived because of it. In times of noise and confusion, it chose to withdraw. Amidst violence, it cultivated love. Faced with lies, it remained faithful to the inner truth. This faithfulness allowed its mission to continue, and it continues. No longer in the desert caves, but in the hearts that, when touched by this story, feel a silent recognition, as if an ancient memory was reactivated. For the persecution has passed, the empires have crumbled, but the light that was once lit never went out. The greatness of the Order of the Illuminated of Judea did not lie in its hidden structure or its discrete rituals, but in the timeless depth of its teachings. While empires rose and fell, while religious doctrines crystallized and wars were waged in the name of interpretations, the wisdom of the Illuminated remained alive, silent, pulsating beneath the surface of history, like a subterranean river of uncontaminated truth. Their teachings were not made for a specific time, nor for a particular culture. They were seeds of eternity planted in prepared hearts, destined to bloom at any time, in any place, where there was a thirst for truth. Unlike philosophical schools that sought rational answers, or religions that sought mass adherence, The order transmitted living keys for the awakening of the soul, and these keys were not lost, for they were passed from spirit to spirit, not as dogmas, but as flashes of lucidity. Among the preserved fragments of tradition, there are accounts of initiatory chants that contain coded truths. These texts were not understandable at first reading, nor were they meant to be. Each line was composed with multiple intentions: a literal reading for the uninitiated, a symbolic interpretation for the disciples, and a profound mystical dive for the awakened. Words like light, kingdom, stone, well, fire, and bread appeared repeatedly, not as mere images, but as living archetypes whose resonance awakened spiritual memories in prepared listeners. Reciting these chants aloud, with full attention, was part of a spiritual exercise that activated the subtle centers of the soul. The words were alive, the symbols acted as keys, and the sound vibrated like medicine. A single verse, recited with presence, could open a window to the eternal. The philosophical tripod of the order was simple and immense: love, truth, and service. Love, not as a volatile emotion, but as a state of compassionate presence. Truth, not as belief, but as lived reality. Service, not as obligation, but as the natural expression of an awakened soul. These three pillars were not taught in theory, but lived by the masters, embodied in their gestures, in their gaze, in their stance towards life. The order taught that the human soul is born with these principles at its core, but that the world covers them with fear, vanity, and distraction. Awakening meant digging beyond these layers and rediscovering what was always there, silently waiting to be recognized. When the disciple rediscovered this core, they understood that there was nothing more to seek. The kingdom was not an achievement, it was a return. The internal paths of spiritual elevation taught by the order were circular, never linear. There wasn't a rigid progression, but rather spirals of deepening. Each awakening experience opened doors to more subtle levels of illusion to be dissolved. It wasn't about accumulating knowledge, but about constant emptying. Every ascent implied a deeper descent into oneself. The masters guided the disciples to recognize that the ego can disguise itself as spirituality and that true wisdom manifests in simplicity. For this reason, the initiates were invited to abandon all pursuit of glory, power, or recognition. Elevation was not measured by visions or supernatural abilities, but by the capacity to love unconditionally, serve in silence, and inhabit the present moment fully. Spiritual discernment was a central virtue. The disciple was trained to perceive the origin of their thoughts, feelings, and desires, identifying which arose from the soul and which came from the ego or external influences. They learned not to react immediately, but to observe, breathe, and consciously choose. This training refined the internal perception to the point where the initiate could hear the whisper of the spirit, even amidst the chaos of the world. The true enlightened one was not the one who isolated themselves from life, but the one who, fully living in it, did not let themselves be dragged by its illusions. This ability to see without being confused, to act without identifying, was the sign of a truly free soul. Detachment was taught not as renunciation of the world, but as liberation from the internal prison. The order did not condemn the pleasures of life, but guided one to live them lightly and consciously, without becoming a slave to them. The disciple learned to love without possessing, to enjoy without attachment, to live without fear of loss. This state of inner freedom was the real miracle. Many came to the order seeking hidden powers, spiritual visions, or cosmic revelations. But the true masters merely smiled and offered the path of detachment. They knew that as long as the seeker desired something from the world, even if it was enlightenment, they would still be trapped. True liberation began when there was nothing left to defend or conquer. The ego was considered a powerful illusion, a mental construct fueled by fear, desire, and memory. Deconstructing it was not an easy task, and therefore the masters were patient. They never attacked the ego directly. Instead, they created situations where the disciple found himself confronted with his own reflections, his masks, his contradictions. In these experiences, often uncomfortable, the disciple learned to recognize his shadows without judgment. Over time, the false self lost strength, and the real being emerged gently. The death of the ego was not a violent event, but a gradual fading, like the fog before the sunlight. And when the ego fell silent, the soul could finally sing. The practice of fasting was used not as mortification of the body, but as a tool for purifying perception. By reducing physical density, the soul became more sensitive to the subtle. Fasts were combined with silence, prayer, and contemplation, creating expanded states of consciousness. In these moments, the disciples had visions, insights, spiritual memories, and inner encounters with luminous presences. But none of this was seen as an end in itself. The masters taught that, after any elevated experience, the true test was to return to simplicity, wash a brother's feet, cultivate the land, take care of a child. The spirit revealed itself in the ordinary. Enlightenment was confirmed in humility. The contemplation of the inner light was one of the most revered practices. It was not about imagining a light, but about silencing both the senses and the mind until the essential light spontaneously emerged. This light was not seen with the physical eyes, but perceived by a deeper sense. It was a living, intelligent, loving presence. The disciples described it as a memory of the true home, a reunion with what they had always been. Being in touch with this light was not a rare event. It was the natural state of the soul when unobstructed. The order taught that all human beings have this light, but most have forgotten how to access it. The work of the enlightened ones was to reignite this memory. Death was seen as a transition, not an end. But more important than physical death was the death of the false self during life. Many of the rituals simulated the process of death. The closing off of the senses, the complete surrender, the symbolic crossing of the veil. By consciously experiencing this, the disciple lost the fear of death and, with that, was freed to live fully. Death, the masters said, takes nothing of truth. It only removes what is illusory. Therefore, the true initiate was already dead to the world, but alive to the spirit. This awareness made him invincible. The order saw time as an illusion created by the mind. The eternal cannot be measured in hours or years, but in presence. Every moment contains the whole. Every gesture can be a doorway to the infinite. For this reason, the enlightened valued the now as the only true temple. They didn't wait for the future to reach the kingdom. They dove into it in this exact moment, with what was available. The practice of mindfulness, conscious breathing, and present sight was central. Living the now fully was the most advanced teaching, and also the simplest. For everything that is not now is illusion. Many of the thoughts that would arise centuries later in esoteric schools, in Gnostic circles, and in medieval Christian mysticism were already present in the teachings of the order, not as theories, but as living practices. The influence they exerted on later movements is undeniable, even if silent. Their gestures are in the hands of the alchemists, their prayers in the words of the Sufis, their visions in the dreams of the mystics. But above all, their spirit lives wherever a soul remembers itself, chooses truth over appearance, and places itself in service of the light. This is the eternity of the teachings of the Illuminated of Judea. They do not belong to the past, they belong to the real. And the real never dies. The Order of the Illuminated from Judea, although operating on the fringes of official history, left silent and profound marks on spiritual figures who transformed the world. Their influence was not direct or institutional, but vibrational, transcending the linearity of facts and touching hearts prepared to hear what was not said, see what was not shown, perceive what would never be taught in conventional temples. Among these figures, some stand out as living reflections of this invisible current. Their teachings, actions, and postures echo the principles of the order with such precision that it would be naive to consider them mere coincidences. The silence of the illuminated whispered in every compassionate gesture, in every word that pointed to the inner kingdom, in every renunciation made for love of the truth. And so, even without proclaiming names, they influenced the brightest souls of antiquity and subsequent ages. John the Baptist, the enigmatic prophet of the desert, is often regarded by spiritual scholars as one of the figures closest to the vibration of the order. His solitary life, his choice for hermitage, his preaching about repentance as a purification of the soul, and his total absence of desire for recognition or power indicate a soul deeply attuned to the tradition of the enlightened. John was not seeking to establish a religion, nor was he summoning crowds with material promises. He called on those who had ears to hear. His baptism in the waters of the Jordan was more than a symbolic rite. It was an initiation into the death of the old self, a vibrational preparation for the emergence of the new. His humble attire, his simple diet, his connection with the silence of the stones and river currents made him not a leader, but a guardian. The order saw in him a spiritual brother who, without using names or titles, revealed the path to the kingdom through his very presence. But perhaps the most powerful echo of the enlightened resonates in the figure of Yeshua, better known as Jesus. Long before he was interpreted as the founder of a religion, Jesus was a traveling teacher, deeply committed to revealing the kingdom of God as an internal and accessible reality in the present. His parables, his healing gestures, his radical compassion, and his veiled criticism of religious hypocrisy bear the unmistakable mark of the order. It is not possible to state with precision whether he was formally initiated among the enlightened, but his life suggests that he was, at the very least, deeply influenced by their teachings. He spoke in metaphors that only the pure of heart could understand. He chose silence over dispute. He gathered disciples based on resonance, not convenience. He said the kingdom was within. He walked among the poor, healed with a touch, and uplifted with his word. Everything in him pointed to the same truth that the order had silently guarded for generations. The Essene community, often associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, shared several practices and views with the order. Even though more organized externally, this community upheld vows of silence, practices of internal purification, meditation, symbolic reading of scriptures, and a life of profound simplicity and fraternity. They believed in the coming of a new age of light and saw the body as the temple of the spirit. Many scholars assert that there was an overlap of members between the Essenes and the Illuminated, or even that the order may have acted as an even more internalized branch of that movement. Regardless, there was a deep alignment between them, the search for inner light, the refusal of corrupt religious powers, and the silent preparation for the arrival of the kingdom. With the passing of the centuries, the teachings of the order continued to reverberate, albeit under new names. The early Gnostic movement, for example, bears many traces of its influence. The idea that salvation does not come from obedience, but from inner knowledge, the gnosis, was central to both the Gnostics and the enlightened. The conception that the material world is just a transient layer of reality, and that humans need to remember their divine origin to return to the full, is identical in both. Many Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, contain phrases almost identical to the parables attributed to silent masters of the order. Although persecuted as heretics, the Gnostics kept a flame alive in the desert of oblivion. The apocryphal Gospels, texts rejected by the official councils of the Church, also provide strong evidence of the Illuminati's influence. In these writings, we find a more intimate portrait of Jesus, less institutional, more mystical and inward. They speak of visions, silences, teachings transmitted to disciples in secret. We find references to inner light, union with the Father through silence and love, and the possibility of spiritual ascension within one's lifetime. The exclusion of these texts from the official narrative was not by chance. In them, religion loses control and the soul regains sovereignty. The order, although it did not write these Gospels, directly influenced the hearts that received, preserved, and transmitted them. Throughout the Middle Ages, the spirit of the order re-emerges in groups such as the Cathars, who inhabited the south of France and lived under vows of simplicity, purity, non-violence, and contemplation. Their rituals of spiritual transmission, the refusal to acknowledge the authority of the institutionalized church, and their doctrine of duality between the physical world and the spiritual world have roots similar to those of the Illuminated. They believed that the true church was invisible, made of pure hearts. They were persecuted, massacred, and silenced, just like the Illuminated centuries before. But like them, they remained faithful to the inner truth until the end, preferring to die in peace rather than betray what they knew to be eternal. The medieval Kabbalistic tradition, especially in the mystical works of the 13th century like the Zohar, reveals clear traces of the spiritual language of the enlightened. The way the tree of life is described, the Sephirot, the role of silence, the importance of inner light, and the concept of devakut, the soul's adherence to God, all echo the practices of the ancient initiates of Judea. It's almost as if, in the corridors of time, the silent wisdom of the order has been reactivated, under a new guise, to continue offering keys to access the light. Many of the authors of the Zohar spoke of secret masters, silent transmissions, hidden schools, subtle hints that the flame never went out. In later times, already in the Renaissance, we find in Hermetic philosophy, spiritual alchemy, and Rosicrucianism the same principles re-emerging in symbolic language. The notion that man is a microcosm of the universe, the idea of inner transmutation, the symbolism of light as truth, and the ritual use of silence are all distant echoes of the work of the order. It is no coincidence that many of these movements used Hebrew, Kabbalah, and apocryphal texts in their practices. The spiritual lineage is subtle, but perceptible to those who have learned to see the invisible threads that connect the ages and awakened hearts. Authentic modern scholars, like Gershom Scholem and others dedicated to the study of Jewish mysticism, often stumbled upon traces of the order without necessarily identifying it as such. In their writings about messianic movements, hidden mystical schools, and silent prayer circles, elements emerge that point directly to practices inherited from the enlightened ones. These scholars record communities that, even without a name or defined structure, kept alive a deep, inner spirituality without the need for dogmas or mediators. As if, in each generation, a spark would arise that would remind, by resonance, that which was never truly lost. The legacy of the order is, therefore, more extensive than one could imagine. It lives in the subtext of scriptures, in the eyes of silent masters, in forgotten practices, in the dreams of seekers. There is no way to confine it to dates, nor assign it to a name. It eludes chronology. It doesn't need recognition because its mission isn't to be seen. It's to transform, awaken, liberate. Wherever there is a soul that silences to hear the inner voice, that chooses love above the norm, that serves without expecting glory, there the order is reborn. Its influence isn't in what it built, but in what it inspired, and what it inspires never dies. As we traverse the silent corridors of history and listen to the whispers of the ancient enlightened ones of Judea, we inevitably encounter a fundamental question. What do these teachings, so ancient, so veiled, so distant from the modern surface, have to do with our time? The answer, for those who dare to listen with the heart and not just the mind, is clear and profound. The current world, marked by an excess of information and a scarcity of meaning, is living a spiritual crisis disguised as progress. We live connected to everything but disconnected from ourselves. We seek incessant distractions, but we run from the silence where truth resides. And it is precisely in this scenario that the light of the enlightened ones begins to shine again, like an invisible lighthouse pointing towards a return to what is essential, eternal, and true. The teaching that was once reserved for the initiated now insinuates itself to those who, tired of the noise, begin to hear the call of the Spirit. The lessons left by the order are more relevant than ever. We live in a time when religious institutions have lost, for many, the ability to lead the soul to fulfillment. Their rituals have become mechanical, their words sound empty, and their leaders often lack the transformative presence that characterized the masters of yesteryears. In this spiritual vacuum, easy promises, success doctrines, and a desperate search for external miracles proliferate. The order, with its silent wisdom, invites us to the opposite, to simplicity, to retreat, to the deep listening of the truth that only reveals itself when the agitation ceases. Instead of demanding blind faith, it offers an invitation to direct experience. Instead of dogmas, practices. Instead of commandments, presence. The modern soul, burdened with concepts, needs to relearn how to feel, and this is where the teachings of the enlightened touch its most urgent need. Seeking the inner kingdom, as proposed by the masters of the order, has become a spiritual urgency for the contemporary human being. We have never had so many external resources, and we have never been so disconnected from true peace. Anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness are not diseases of the soul, but symptoms of its neglect. The order taught that the kingdom is not a place found after death, but a dimension of being accessible through silence, attention, and love. This kingdom is present at this very moment, behind the thin veil of the restless mind. It does not need to be conquered, it needs to be revealed. And revealing this kingdom is, today, more than a spiritual act. It is a survival necessity for the human soul in the face of the imminent collapse of collective consciousness. Applying the teachings of the order in modern day-to-day life does not require us to retreat to the desert or abandon practical life. On the contrary, it means transforming the ordinary into extraordinary, the mundane into sacred, the moment into eternal. It means cultivating silence even amidst noise, practicing presence even in the rush, choosing love even when the world insists on indifference. One of the greatest legacies of the order is the recognition that the most sacred temple is the now. There is no more powerful initiation than sitting in silence, breathing attentively and feeling, in depth, the mystery of existence. The practices of the enlightened, conscious fasting, symbolic contemplation, sacred chanting, intuitive reading of the scriptures, can be adapted, reinvented, and applied by any sincere seeker, regardless of religion or culture. Silence, so despised by modernity, reemerges here as a real path to healing and reconnection. The order reminds us that the deepest answers do not come from analysis, but from listening. It is not necessary to understand everything. It is necessary to be present. Silence is a teacher who never lies. It is in the space between thoughts that the truth whispers, and when the soul learns to rest in this space, fear dissolves, anxiety loses its power, and love emerges as the center. This silence is not an escape, it is radical presence. It is in it that the ego dies and the true self is reborn. And as paradoxical as it may seem, this rebirth is not spectacular. It is gentle, so gentle that it goes unnoticed to the world's eyes, but it transforms everything from within. Deep introspection, celebrated by the order, is today the antidote to an outward-facing society. The rampant quest for distractions, achievements, and external validation has left humans exhausted, fragmented, and unsatisfied. The enlightened teach us to turn our eyes inward, to traverse the labyrinth of the ego, to face our shadows not with judgment, but with compassion. Each wound is a portal, each fear, an invitation, each pain, an opportunity for immersion. And it is in this immersion that we rediscover what we had lost, the connection with the essence. The order does not promise a life without pain, but teaches pain as a path. Suffering is not a punishment, but a passage. And those who learn to cross it in silence find, on the other side, the light that never goes out. The internal alchemy, once taught in secret rituals, now reveals itself as a conscious process of transmuting density into light. It's not about transforming lead into physical gold, but transforming ignorance into wisdom, fear into confidence, separation into unity. This process takes place in the heart, in the body, in the mind. It's a daily, patient, profound work. The masters of the order used symbols, gestures, and breaths to activate this process in the disciples. Today, we have access to these tools adapted in practices like meditation, conscious breathing, guided visualizations, mantras, and symbolic readings. The difference lies in the intention and presence. Understanding life as a sacred laboratory and the body as an alchemical temple is one of the greatest gifts that the order offers to the modern soul. Rescuing personal sacredness is another powerful invitation from the enlightened. We live in times of weakened religiosity and superficial spirituality. The order teaches us that contact with the divine does not depend on temples nor on intermediaries. It is in the attentive gaze, in the truthful word, in the silent gesture of compassion. It is in the preparation of food, in the care of the body, in listening to a friend, in contemplating nature. When everything becomes sacred, nothing else is mundane, and it is in this state of silent reverence that the soul flourishes. Spirituality does not need to be performed. It needs to be lived, embodied. breathed. This return to everyday sacredness is one of the deepest healings the world can experience. Amid the chaos of the world, the growing polarization, the global crises, the teachings of the Order sound like a soft symphony amidst the deafening noise. They do not deny suffering, nor ignore the pains of time. On the contrary, they teach that it is possible to maintain clarity, presence, and love even in the midst of the storm. The enlightened one is not the one who isolates himself from the world's pain, but the one who, being deeply rooted in the inner kingdom, becomes an anchor of peace in the eye of the hurricane. He doesn't need to say anything, his presence transforms. And today, more than ever, the world needs these presences. Silent but radiant, invisible but fundamental. It's not an exaggeration to say that a new order is emerging, not as an institution, but as a vibration. Not as an organization, but as a frequency. Men and women around the world are quietly awakening to a more conscious, more truthful, more loving life. They don't know each other, they don't use a common name, they don't follow a visible master, but they are connected, they feel the call, they are coming home, they are becoming unknowingly the new enlightened ones of the modern age. The Order lives within them. It lives within you. Every conscious breath, every choice for good, every silence full of presence is a continuation of the sacred mission. The true legacy of the enlightened is not in the past. It is here, it is now. It is in the soul that chooses to remember, that opens itself to listen, that decides to walk with courage, even without guarantees. The kingdom is near, not as a distant promise, but as a living reality. The light is not far away. It pulses within. And the masters of the Order, even invisible, remain present. In dreams, in intuitions, in meaningful encounters, in words that touch deeply, in tears that purify. They walk beside you, as they always have, and they whisper, as they always whispered, remember, return, reignite. Among all the veils that separate the human being from their divine essence, there is one that is more subtle, more resistant, and at the same time more fragile than all the others. This is the last veil, the one that is no longer in front of the eyes, but merges with the identity itself. It is the veil of the final illusion, the idea that we are merely this body, this name, this story. The Order of the Illuminated of Judea knew that crossing the last veil could not be taught, explained, or demonstrated. It could only be lived, experienced, traversed in the absolute silence of the heart. Therefore, they guarded this stage with the utmost care, transmitting its essence only to those who had overcome all the previous labyrinths. The last veil does not dissolve with study or effort. It dissolves with surrender. There is no way to cross it without dying to everything that one thinks they are. And this dying is, paradoxically, the most real birth one can have. The ancient masters taught that the deepest truth would never be written, nor could it be spoken without losing its power. It is like a fragrance, unseen but felt. It's like an invisible touch that breaks all defenses, dissolves all fears, and reveals in a single instant what has always been present. This final secret of the Order was not a formula, nor a doctrine, but an experience of total unity. Once this threshold is crossed, everything changes. There is no more inside and outside, no more subject and object, no more search. The seeker disappears, and what remains is pure presence, pure light, pure silence. There is no return from this place, for the one who returns is not the same. The one who has crossed the final veil no longer belongs to time. They belong to the eternal. Many who approach this threshold hesitated. The mind, with all its conditioning, tries to cling to the security of forms, even the spiritual ones. The image of a spiritual self, of a realized master, is still an illusion that needs to fall. Therefore, the last teaching of the Order was always given symbolically, in gestures, in long silences, in looks that pierced the soul. The disciple, already purified by all previous stages, received not an instruction, but a presence. And in this presence he understood without words. The last veil is not torn by action, it is dissolved by grace. And this grace only manifests when everything has been abandoned, the search, the merit, the expectation. The last secret of the Order is the secret of total surrender. This experience transformed the initiate not into a special being, but into someone absolutely ordinary. He returned to the world, but not in the same way. He walked among people as an equal, but each gesture was sacred, each glance a silent blessing, each word a living seed. He was no longer driven by desires or fears, but by a deep, calm, unshakable compassion. The true initiate no longer needed to prove anything. His life was the proof. He became a living mirror of the kingdom, and this mirror did not reflect his image, but the light of the Spirit. He was discreet, serene, present. He was one with everything, without ceasing to be nobody. The Order, even after centuries of silence and transformation, remains active at this point in the journey. It is no longer in the caves of Judea, nor in the ancient manuscripts. It is wherever there is a soul ready to cross the final veil. Whenever someone turns inward with radical sincerity, whenever someone chooses silence over reaction, forgiveness over revenge, love over fear, there the Order makes its presence known. There is no need to belong to a formal lineage, nor follow a specific ritual. It is enough to be willing to die to what is false and allow the real to emerge. The final initiation is not made by external masters. It is made by the light that inhabits the being itself. The call to introspection is the true invitation of the Order in current times. There's no need to flee from the world, but to penetrate it with a new vision. To see God in the eyes of a stranger, to hear the sacred silence amidst traffic, to feel eternity in the present moment. The deepest practice is to live each moment as if it were the first time, because it is. Time, as the enlightened ones taught, is merely a shattered mirror. When consciousness returns to the absolute now, everything unites. Past, future, identity, separation. Everything dissolves in the living presence of the being. This state is the kingdom, and there is no one who can prevent us from accessing it except ourselves. You, who have listened up to this point, may feel this echo in your chest, a memory that cannot be explained, a longing with no origin, a certainty that comes without reason. This is the whisper of the ancients. They are not far. They are with you, within you, around you, like an invisible network of love supporting your journey. It's no coincidence that this knowledge has reached you. The Order never called crowds, it called hearts. And if you have been touched, do not ignore it. This is the moment. The veil is thin, life is inviting. The kingdom does not demand perfection, only surrender. The last teaching of the Order was never written, because it cannot be taught, it can only be recognized. It is in the subtleties of silence, in the space between words, in the sparkle in the eyes of those who have awakened. It is in the moment when you pause, breathe, and realize that you are already where you've always wanted to be. That everything you sought outside already dwells within you. That the temple you were searching for is your own being. That the kingdom was never far away. It was just waiting for you to open the right eyes, not those of the body, but those of the soul. And now, these eyes are beginning to open. The echo of the Order continues to reverberate in dreams, in intuitions, in coincidences that are not coincidences. They speak through art, music, nature, unexpected encounters. Everything around you can be a call. Nothing is random. Reality is a living book, written with invisible letters, and each page leads you to the center. The center is the point where everything dissolves and everything is revealed, where separation ceases and unity sings, where the name no longer matters, for the being is enough. The last veil is this, the disappearance of everything that is not you, so that only what always was remains. Waking up is an act of courage, not because it requires effort, but because it requires surrender. And surrendering is the biggest challenge for the ego. That's why so few cross the last veil. Most prefer to remain in the safety of ideas, even if false. But you are not most. You have come this far. You heard the call. You felt the touch. And now, all you need to do is allow. Allow the false to fall. Let the old die. Let the new be born, without guarantees, without answers, just with the trust that the unseen takes care. Because it does. It always has. And now, more than ever, it is by your side, supporting your journey. The kingdom is here. It will not come tomorrow nor after death. It throbs in this moment, in this place, in this breath. The order was never an organization. It is a frequency, and you, by silencing and remembering, become part of it. Not by merit, but by resonance. Not by effort, but by truth. And this truth is simple. What you seek, you already are. What you desire is already with you. What you yearn for has always inhabited you. Now the veil unravels. And where there was separation, light is born. The same light that guided the ancients. The same light that now, silently, awakens in you. Welcome back. If this silent journey through the veils of consciousness has touched something within you, Mind Unfettered, please share in the comments. Which veil do you feel you still need to cross? Is there a memory, a calling, an intuition that has been resurfacing strongly in your life lately? Share with us. Each sincere sharing reverberates like a mirror for other seekers. And remember, when we comment with truth, we anchor this truth in the field. We are co-creating a field of spiritual manifestation together. This is not just a space of content. It's a living order of expanding awakened souls. Now, if you felt that there is more to be revealed, you're right. The journey doesn't end here. In the next video, we will decipher one of the most hidden and powerful codes from Yeshua's initiatory lineage, the Book of 33 Steps, the hidden map Jesus left for enlightenment. You will see that there is a hidden map, left not in stone, but in vibration, that reveals the concrete steps of enlightenment. And this map begins to reveal itself in the next stage of this trail. Click on the screen now to follow the sacred trail and continue this awakening. You've already begun. Now, all that's left is to remember. Mind Unfettered, you are a part of this. The order lives in you, for you, and through you.